The sun hung low over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long golden streaks through the trees. The late afternoon air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. It was a peaceful evening, at least it should have been. Malcolm Hayes walked at a steady pace along the sidewalk, his 6'2" frame moving with the quiet discipline of a soldier who had spent years in the field. His every step was measured, his posture relaxed but alert. At his side, Rex, his loyal German shepherd, padded along in perfect sync, his ears flicking at every sound, his sharp eyes scanning the street as if instinctively on patrol. Malcolm had been back home for less than a week after his latest security consulting mission overseas. This evening walk with Rex was supposed to be his way of adjusting back to civilian life. But no matter how hard he tried, something always felt off. He wasn't paranoid. He had been trained to read situations long before they unfolded. And right now he could feel it, the weight of eyes on him. A black sedan at the end of the street slowed as it approached an intersection. A jogger hesitated mid-stride before turning in the opposite direction. A curtain in one of the houses across the street shifted slightly. These things were subtle, but to Malcolm they were red flags. It always happened. This was a neighborhood where people walked golden retrievers, not German shepherds, where men in suits felt entitled to the world, and people who looked like Malcolm, black men with strong builds and sharp eyes, were watched. Rex let out a low growl, picking up on the shift in his handler's energy. Malcolm exhaled, reaching down to pat the dog's side. "Easy, boy," he murmured, keeping his steps even. But the unease in his gut remained. Then the unmistakable hum of a police cruiser reached his ears. "Here we go." A black and white patrol car turned the corner up ahead, creeping forward at a deliberate pace. Malcolm recognized the tactic immediately. They were moving slow, scanning, looking for a reason to stop someone, and the second they saw him, that reason had been found. The cruiser pulled up alongside him. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a uniformed officer with sharp features and cold blue eyes. Officer Gregory Callaway. Next to him, already stepping out of the vehicle, was his partner, Officer Anthony Miller. Both men were well known in the neighborhood, not because they served and protected, but because they ruled through intimidation. "Afternoon," Callaway called out, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Malcolm stopped, keeping his posture neutral. He had dealt with men like this before. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, keeping his tone polite but firm. Miller took a step closer, hands resting on his belt where his gun and baton sat holstered. The move was subtle, meant to establish dominance. "You live around here?" Callaway asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yes, sir," Malcolm answered without hesitation. Callaway raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting the immediate respect. "That's so. Don't think I've seen you before," he mused. Malcolm offered a small nod. "I travel a lot for work. Just got back a few days ago." Miller scoffed under his breath. "That right? And what kind of work is that?" "Security consulting," Malcolm answered. Callaway's smirk deepened. "Security consulting, huh? That's some fancy way of saying mercenary?" Malcolm chuckled softly, as if unfazed. "Let them think they had the upper hand." "Not quite," he said easily. "I help train teams for emergency response. Corporations, government agencies." Callaway nodded slowly, his eyes studying Malcolm with something close to amusement. "Well," he said, shifting his weight, "we got a call about someone suspicious in the neighborhood. Figured we'd check it out." Malcolm raised an eyebrow but kept his tone even. "I see. Didn't realize walking my dog was considered suspicious." Callaway's smirk widened. "You'd be surprised what people think is suspicious these days." Miller took another slow step closer, his gaze dropping to Rex. The German shepherd was still standing calmly, but his body was tense, his instincts sharp. "That's a big dog," Miller commented, feigning interest. "Trained?" "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied. Miller nodded. "Trained for what?" "Obedience. Protection," Malcolm said, his voice still calm. "He's disciplined." Miller's expression darkened slightly. "Yeah? Trained to attack?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "No. trained to follow commands. Callaway let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. Well, let's see some ID, he said. It wasn't a request. Malcolm knew his rights. He could refuse. He could ask why. But he also knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. Of course, he said smoothly, already reaching into his jacket. Rex let out the faintest rumble of a growl as Malcolm moved, his protective instincts kicking in. Easy, Malcolm murmured, giving the leash a small tug. Callaway's fingers twitched near his belt. Whoa, Miller muttered, his voice a little sharper. You might want to keep that thing under control. Malcolm remained calm. Rex is fine. He's well trained. Callaway chuckled under his breath. Yeah? We'll see about that. There was something in his tone that made Malcolm's stomach tighten. He pulled his wallet out carefully, holding it up for them to take. Miller took it lazily, flipping it open with disinterest, until his fingers traced over the identification card. His lips twisted slightly before he turned it toward Callaway. Well, look at that, Miller mused, shaking his head. We got ourselves a real soldier. Callaway barely glanced at it before waving his hand dismissively. Nah, he said, shifting slightly. I think we're going to need you to step over here for a second. Just a few questions. Malcolm exhaled slowly, carefully. Don't give them an excuse. He gave Rex's leash a light tug, signaling the command to stand down. Then he took a single step forward. And that was when everything changed. Miller reached out, placing a firm hand on Malcolm's wrist. A power move. A provocation. Rex growled, his body stiffening. Both officers immediately reached for their weapons. Control your damn dog, Miller barked. Malcolm's voice snapped like a whip. He is controlled! But it was too late. A gunshot split the air. The leash jerked violently in Malcolm's hand. And then, Rex stumbled. For a second, the world froze. Then the weight of his best friend collapsed against him. A sharp, pained whimper. Blood pooling onto the pavement. Malcolm's breath hitched, his vision blurred with something dark, hotter than rage. Callaway exhaled, shaking his head. Told you he was a liability. Malcolm barely heard them. He was staring into Rex's fading eyes. The dog who had saved his life countless times. The one being who had never betrayed him. And now, he was gone. Malcolm wasn't just angry. He was at war. The fluorescent lights in the holding cell buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the cold concrete walls. Malcolm Hayes sat on the metal bench, wrists cuffed, his mind a storm of rage and grief. The blood on his hands, Rex's blood, had dried, but the weight of it still clung to his skin like a curse. He had been here for hours. The officers hadn't said much after throwing him into the cell. They didn't need to. They had already won. Or so they thought. The steel door creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped in, followed by a woman in a sharply tailored navy blue suit. Her heels clicked against the floor with authority, and her expression was a controlled storm of fury. Where's Malcolm's sister? A high-powered defense attorney who had built her career tearing apart men like Callaway and Miller in the courtroom. The officer uncuffed Malcolm without a word, then stepped back. Jasmine crossed her arms. Let's go. Malcolm rose to his feet, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't speak as they walked out of the holding area, past the officers who barely spared him a glance. Outside the precinct, the night air hit his skin, cool and sharp, but it did nothing to quell the fire burning inside him. Jasmine turned on him the second they reached her car. What the hell happened? She demanded. They said Rex was aggressive, that he wasn't. Malcolm cut in, his voice flat, deadened. He never even moved toward them. Jasmine's jaw tightened, her hands balling into fists. I know. I already requested the body cam footage, but guess what? It's missing. Malcolm let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course it is. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Malcolm, listen to me. This isn't over. We'll take legal action. Civil lawsuit, press charges. We'll... "They're not going to pay for this," he interrupted, turning to face her fully. "You know that." Jasmine hesitated. She wanted to argue. She wanted to believe in the system she had dedicated her life to. But Malcolm wasn't just her brother. He was a decorated soldier, a man who had spent years fighting in the shadows of war. He could read people like an open book, and right now he could see the doubt in her eyes. "The department already ruled it a justified shooting, didn't they?" he asked. Jasmine exhaled sharply. "Internal affairs cleared them this morning. No excessive force, no misconduct, just another tragic misunderstanding." Malcolm clenched his jaw, staring past her, his hands flexing at his sides. "They murdered him, Jasmine, and they walked away like it was nothing." Jasmine looked away, her throat tightening. "I'll fight this," she said softly. "I swear to you, Malcolm, I won't let this go." Malcolm said nothing, because he wasn't going to let it go either. But his way wouldn't involve courtrooms or legal arguments. His way would be absolute. By the time they reached Malcolm's house, the news was already spinning its version of events. A news anchor's voice played from the TV in Jasmine's living room. A tense confrontation between police officers and a man walking his dog turned deadly last night when officers were forced to fire on the animal. Officials say the dog, a large German shepherd, exhibited aggressive behavior, leaving the officers no choice but to defend themselves. The man, identified as Malcolm Hayes, was taken into custody after a brief struggle. Authorities confirmed that Hayes, a former soldier, has a history of military combat experience, raising concerns about his potential threat level in high-pressure situations. Malcolm stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. Jasmine muted the TV. "That's what they're running with," she said bitterly. "No context, no real story. Just another black man painted as a threat." Malcolm's fingers curled into fists. "They expect me to let this go," he murmured. Jasmine crossed her arms. "You won't. I know you too well." She studied him carefully, her lawyer's mind analyzing every shift in his expression, every subtle tell in his posture. Then she sighed. "Just promise me you won't do anything reckless." Malcolm's gaze flicked toward her, but he didn't answer. Because what he was about to do wasn't reckless. It was calculated. And it had already begun. Across town, inside a dimly lit bar, Callaway and Miller sat at a corner booth, whiskey glasses in hand. "You see the news?" Miller smirked, taking a slow sip. "They're eating it up. Dangerous ex-military suspect detained after officers defend themselves. We couldn't have written it better ourselves." Callaway chuckled, leaning back in his seat. "I told you, people like him, they're disposable. No one gives a damn about some ex-soldier's mutt." Miller shook his head, grinning. "You should have seen his face when the dog dropped." "I thought he was going to tear us apart right there." Callaway snorted. "Yeah? And where is he now?" Miller smirked. "Booked, processed, and humiliated. Right where he belongs." They clinked their glasses together in a silent toast. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. They had no idea they had just signed their own death warrants. Malcolm sat alone in his darkened living room, the only light coming from the TV screen. His mind was clear, his emotions honed into something sharp. He pulled open the drawer of the side table. Inside lay a single, unassuming black case. He unlatched it. Nestled inside was his old military-issued combat knife, the one he had carried through countless missions, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count. His fingers curled around the handle, the weight of it grounding him. Rex had saved him more than once, protected him, trusted him. And now Malcolm was going to return the favor. Not with justice, not with laws, with vengeance. Callaway and Miller had no idea what was coming. The world had changed for Malcolm Hayes. Once he had been a soldier who followed orders, a man who believed in the system, in discipline, in justice. But justice was an illusion, a story they told people like him to keep them in line. The police had murdered Rex, The system had protected them. Now Malcolm wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a hunter, and the hunt had begun. Malcolm didn't move recklessly. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about precision. Callaway and Miller were corrupt, but they weren't working alone. Malcolm had seen it in their confidence, in the way internal affairs had covered for them so quickly. There were bigger players in this game. Through his military connections, he started digging. Within days, he had a list. Chief of Police Henry Slater, the man at the top, known for sweeping misconduct under the rug, protected his officers at any cost. Councilman Richard Vaughn, old money, used police like his personal security force, had funded Callaway and Miller's promotions. Police Union President Frank Monroe, the fixer, any cop caught in a scandal, he made it disappear. Malcolm wasn't just taking down 2 officers. He was burning the whole system to the ground. Malcolm started watching him. Routine, patterns, weaknesses. Work. Callaway worked the night shift 3 times a week. Left the station at 2 a.m. Always took the back roads home. Lived alone. No family. Spent most of his nights at a bar 2 blocks from the station. Habits, always drunk by midnight. Used cash to avoid leaving a trail. Carried a spare gun in his glove compartment. The man thought he was untouchable. He had no idea Malcolm was studying him like prey. Malcolm wasn't just going to break Callaway physically. He was going to destroy everything he had ever built. He hacked into old police reports. Corrupt officers always left a trail. It just took someone smart enough to follow it. And Malcolm found everything. Callaway had covered up multiple beatings, planted drugs in at least 4 cases, had been paid under the table by Vaughn's office to harass black-owned businesses, had assaulted a black teenager last year, case dismissed due to lack of evidence. Malcolm compiled it all, every crime, every abuse. When he was done, Callaway's sins were ready to be exposed to the world. But before that, Callaway needed to suffer. The first strike wasn't physical. It was mental. Malcolm left the first message at Callaway's doorstep. A single black envelope, inside just one sentence. We see you. No name, no signature. Just a promise. Callaway found it the next morning. He glanced around, scowling at the empty street. Then he tore the letter apart and threw it in the trash. But Malcolm knew. He was already in his head. The next night, Malcolm followed him to the bar. Callaway was at his usual spot, whiskey in hand, laughing with Miller. Malcolm didn't make contact. He just watched. Callaway noticed. He glanced around. His eyes flickered toward the far end of the bar, where Malcolm had been standing just seconds before. But Malcolm was already gone. Just a shadow, a whisper in the dark. 2 nights later, Callaway's car alarm blared in the middle of the night. He ran outside, gun drawn, but there was no one there. Only his tires, slashed. And on his windshield, another note. Not so fun when you're the one being hunted, is it? Callaway cursed under his breath, scanning the empty streets. He was getting paranoid. Exactly what Malcolm wanted. Callaway started losing control. The next day at work, he snapped at Miller. Someone's messing with me, he growled. Who the hell is it? Miller frowned. What are you talking about? Callaway clenched his jaw. I don't know, but someone's been watching me. Someone slashed my damn tires. Miller scoffed. You think it's Hayes? Callaway hesitated. Because deep down, he knew. But he couldn't prove it. And that made it worse. It was time. Malcolm didn't want Callaway to just fear him. He wanted him broken. It was 2 a.m. Callaway had just left the bar, staggering slightly as he walked toward his car. Malcolm was already waiting. He moved like a ghost, stepping out from the shadows just as Callaway reached for his keys. Rough night? Malcolm's voice was calm. Too calm. Callaway's breath caught. He spun around, reaching for his gun too slow. Malcolm slammed his elbow into Callaway's wrist, knocking the weapon away. Callaway stumbled back, eyes wide. You! Malcolm struck again, A swift, brutal punch to the gut. Callaway doubled over, gasping. Malcolm caught him by the collar, pulling him close. "Do you know what it's like to feel powerless?" he murmured. Callaway struggled. You're making a mistake." Malcolm tightened his grip. "No, you did. The day you killed Rex." Then he slammed Callaway's head against the car. Callaway crumpled to the ground. Malcolm crouched beside him. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. Then he stood up, walked away, left Callaway bleeding in the alley. Next, Miller's turn. The predator had become the prey. Officer Gregory Callaway had spent his career ruling with fear. He had planted evidence, beaten suspects, and silenced anyone who dared to challenge him. He had built his power on intimidation. But now, he was the one being hunted. It started with small things. At first, Callaway dismissed them. A car parked down the street with its engine running just a little too long, a shadow moving outside his house at night. The uneasy feeling that someone was watching him. He told himself it was nothing, just paranoia. But then the notes started appearing. The first note was left on his doorstep. A plain white envelope, no name, no return address. Inside, a single piece of paper. "We see you." Callaway stood on his porch staring at the words. His hands clenched. He looked around, scanning the empty street. No one was there. He ripped the paper in half and stormed back inside. But the next morning, there was another note. "You thought it was over?" Callaway's breath caught. He grabbed his gun, threw open the front door, and aimed wildly into the yard. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of entry. It was like a ghost was haunting him. And then, the phone calls started. At first, it was just silence. He would pick up, say hello, and hear nothing but breathing. Then the whispers began. "Not so fun, is it?" Callaway slammed the phone down, sweat forming on his brow. By the third night, he had stopped sleeping. Every noise outside made him reach for his gun. He was unraveling. The following night, Callaway sat in his dimly lit living room, his Glock resting on the coffee table. He hadn't been to work in 2 days. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself another drink. Then, a noise. A faint rustling outside. Callaway froze. He reached for his gun and crept toward the window, peering through the blinds. A shadow moved across the yard. Someone was out there. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, his heart pounding. He yanked open the door, stepping onto the porch, weapon raised. "Who's out there?" he bellowed. Silence. Then, a whisper from the darkness. "Did Rex beg too?" Callaway's blood ran cold. Then, a sudden noise behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. His breathing was ragged. He was losing it. He retreated inside, locking the door, sweat slicking his face. Somewhere out in the shadows, Malcolm was watching. And he was smiling. Callaway couldn't take it anymore. He needed a drink, needed to get out of the damn house. At midnight, he stumbled into his usual bar, gulping down whiskey like it was medicine. But even here, he felt eyes on him. He looked around the room. A man at the back of the bar held his gaze for a second too long. Callaway's stomach twisted. Was it him? No, it couldn't be. Could it? Shaking his head, he paid his tab and walked outside. The alley was dark, damp from the recent rain. His car was parked just around the corner. He walked faster. A noise behind him. He turned. Nothing. He exhaled sharply. He needed to get his head straight. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was there. Callaway spun around, reaching for his gun too late. A hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting it violently. The gun clattered to the ground. Before Callaway could react, a brutal fist slammed into his ribs. He gasped, doubling over. Another blow to the face, his vision blurred. Then the pressure of a hand gripping his throat, slamming him against the brick wall. Callaway's eyes widened in terror. Malcolm, the ex-soldier, stood in front of him, his face unreadable, his grip like iron. Callaway choked out a breath. "Hey, Hayes!" Malcolm leaned in close. His voice was calm, controlled, cold. "Did Rex beg too?" Callaway's breath hitched. Then, boom, a devastating punch to the gut. Callaway collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Malcolm crouched beside him. "You always had the power, didn't you?" His voice was almost thoughtful. "Always had that badge to hide behind. The system to protect you. But now," he grabbed Callaway's collar, yanking him up slightly. "You're just another coward in the dark." Then, Malcolm let loose. A ruthless, bone-cracking beatdown. Callaway tried to fight back, but he wasn't a fighter. He was a bully. And bullies crumbled when the real fight came to them. Fists collided with ribs. A knee drove into his stomach. A final, crushing punch to the jaw. Callaway collapsed, barely conscious. Blood dripped from his nose, pooling into the cold pavement. Malcolm stood over him. "This is what fear feels like," he said softly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He took a picture. Callaway's battered, bloodied face. "Consider this my warning shot," Malcolm said. He stood up, tossing the phone beside Callaway's broken body. "Next time, you won't walk away." Then without another word, he disappeared into the night. The next morning, Callaway's picture was all over social media. "Crooked cop gets his karma. Where's your badge now? Officer Callaway, another dirty cop exposed." People laughed at him. The same people who had once feared him now mocked his downfall. The department? They didn't defend him. They cut him loose. Chief Slater issued a statement condemning reckless officer behavior to avoid scrutiny. The city council distanced themselves. And just like that, Callaway was finished. His power, his reputation, everything he had built, gone. Miller. Callaway had been the warning. Miller? He was the example. And Malcolm was coming for him. After Callaway's very public humiliation, Officer Anthony Miller was on edge. He had spent the last few nights sleeping with his gun under his pillow. His movements were precise, controlled. No drinking, no staying out late. He switched up his driving routes, looking over his shoulder every time he stepped outside. He was paranoid, but not paranoid enough, because he thought Callaway's attack was random. He thought it was some street thug trying to get revenge on a dirty cop. He had no idea. He had no idea Malcolm was coming for him next. Miller wasn't alone. Unlike Callaway, he had bigger protection. He was tied to Police Chief Henry Slater and Councilman Richard Vaughn, both of whom had a vested interest in keeping him safe. Because Miller wasn't just a crooked cop. He was a cleanup man. Whenever an officer shot an innocent man, Miller was the one who planted drugs on the body. Whenever a rich businessman needed a police report altered, Miller handled it. Whenever a black-owned business needed to be harassed, Miller made sure they were investigated. Miller wasn't just corrupt. He was a fixer, a professional liar, a snake. And Malcolm was about to cut off the head. Malcolm knew attacking Miller physically wouldn't be enough. This time, he needed to make him disappear. He needed to erase him, step by step. Miller had spent years covering up crimes, but Malcolm had found something Miller thought was buried forever. An old case, a murder cover-up from 4 years ago. A black teenager shot by an off-duty cop. The officer? One of Miller's friends. The gun? Planted. The witnesses? Threatened. The evidence? Destroyed. Or so Miller thought. Because Malcolm had found the one piece of evidence Miller had missed. An old backup copy of body cam footage stored deep in police servers. Malcolm didn't need to expose it. He just needed Miller to panic. The next morning, Miller received an unmarked envelope. Inside, a printed still frame from the missing body cam footage. The murder scene, the one Miller had helped cover up. On the back, one sentence. "Still think it's erased?" Miller's hands shook. He ripped up the paper, threw it in the trash, and locked his door. But the real damage was already done. He was scared, he was making mistakes, and Malcolm was watching every single one. Malcolm knew Miller would try to erase the evidence. It was who he was. So Malcolm set the stage. He planted a fake police report in an old precinct database, making it look like the evidence was still physically stored in an abandoned warehouse, a place where police used to keep old case files before digitizing everything. Then he waited. And as expected, Miller took the bait. 2:30 a.m. Miller drove through the abandoned industrial district, headlights cutting through the fog. He pulled up outside the old warehouse, checking his surroundings twice. Oh, no one was there. Or so he thought. He stepped inside, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. The place was dead silent. Metal shelves covered in dust, rusted file cabinets, broken windows. Miller moved quickly, scanning the room. Then he saw it. A single file folder placed in the center of a metal table. Labeled, Evidence Room, Backup, 2019 Incident. Miller's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears. He lunged for it, flipping it open, empty. No documents. Just a single sheet of paper. You thought you could erase the evidence? You are the evidence. Miller's hands went cold. Then the door behind him slammed shut. He spun around, gun raised. Too slow. A shadow moved in the dark. Then a hand closed around his wrist, twisting it violently. Asterisk. The gun dropped. Miller barely had time to react before a brutal punch drove into his ribs. He stumbled, gasping. Another blow, then another. Faster, heavier, merciless. His vision blurred. Then, a voice. Low, calm, lethal. You erase people for a living. Let's see how it feels when you're the one who disappears. Malcolm dragged Miller to the ground, slamming him against the concrete. Miller coughed up blood. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but Malcolm wasn't listening. He pulled out a burner phone, snapped a photo of Miller's battered face. Then he crouched beside him, gripping his hair, forcing him to look up. This is the last time anyone sees you. Miller's eyes went wide. Please, we can work something out. Malcolm smiled. You're already gone. Then, darkness. Officer Anthony Miller vanished without a trace. No calls, no texts. His car was found outside the warehouse, driver's door open. Inside the vehicle, a single photograph of Miller, bruised, bloodied, terrified, and scrawled across the windshield in red marker, corruption erased. The department was in chaos. 2 corrupt officers taken down back to back, one humiliated, the other gone. Chief Slater and Councilman Vaughn knew exactly what was happening. Someone was hunting them, and they were next. He wasn't finished. Callaway was the warning. Miller was the example. Now, Malcolm was coming for the men who ran the system, and they had nowhere to hide. Callaway was humiliated. Miller had vanished. But the real enemy was still standing. Malcolm knew that Callaway and Miller were just soldiers in a bigger war, tools of a system that had been corrupt for decades. The men who really ran things, Chief of Police Henry Slater, Councilman Richard Vaughn, and the police union president Frank Monroe, were still untouchable. Not for long. Malcolm wasn't here for small wins. He was here to burn the whole damn system to the ground. Malcolm had spent weeks collecting classified information, bribery records, false police reports, body cam footage that had been wiped from public records. But leaking information alone wouldn't be enough. He had to destroy them completely. And for that, he needed someone who could turn this evidence into a firestorm. He needed a hacker. Through his old military contacts, Malcolm was introduced to a notorious hacker known only as Shadow Fox, a digital ghost, a cyber vigilante who had taken down dirty politicians, exposed corporate corruption, and erased the online existence of people who thought they were above justice. They met in a darkened apartment, lit only by the glow of monitors filled with scrolling code. Shadow Fox turned to Malcolm, smirking. I looked into you. You've been busy. Malcolm sat across from him, sliding a USB drive across the table. "Everything you need is in there," Malcolm said. "Bribes, false arrests, illegal business dealings. It's time to let the world see what's really going on." Shadowfox plugged in the drive, his fingers flying over the keyboard as files opened up, one damning piece of evidence after another. He let out a low whistle. "Oh man, this is career-ending. This is life-ending. You really want to go nuclear?" Malcolm's voice was cold. "No, I want to make history." Within 24 hours, the evidence was everywhere. Breaking news. Massive police corruption scandal explodes. Leaked documents expose systemic racism and bribery in city law enforcement. Mayor and chief of police linked to cover-ups in illegal operations. The media went into a frenzy. Thousands of pages of police misconduct reports, classified emails, and financial transactions flooded the internet. Videos surfaced, dash cam footage of brutal beatings, body cam clips of officers planting evidence, recordings of corrupt city officials laughing about controlling the streets. It was no longer just about Malcolm. It was about an entire city waking up to the truth. The city erupted. Protests flooded the streets. People held up signs. "Justice for the victims. Expose the corrupt. No more killer cops." News channels broadcast the evidence 24/7. Social media exploded. Millions of shares. Millions of angry voices demanding justice. And for the first time in decades, the people weren't afraid anymore. The system that had ruled with fear was now running scared. Chief Slater, Councilman Vaughn, and Frank Monroe had ruled the city like kings. But kings fall the hardest when the people turn against them. The chief of police blamed the mayor. The mayor blamed the police union. The union president tried to cut a deal with the feds. It was every man for himself, and the public was watching them burn. 3 days after the leak, a SWAT team raided the chief of police's mansion. Slater was dragged out in handcuffs, his face plastered across every news station in the country. Embezzlement, obstruction of justice, racketeering. The charges kept piling up. The people cheered. But Malcolm wasn't done yet, because he still had one final target: Councilman Richard Vaughn. Vaughn had spent his career untouchable. Politicians like him didn't go to prison. They didn't get caught. They made the rules. But Malcolm wasn't playing by the rules anymore. One night, Vaughn arrived home to find his security guards unconscious outside his front gate. He barely had time to react before a black-gloved hand wrapped around his throat, slamming him against his own car. Malcolm stared him down. "You built this empire," Malcolm said, voice dangerously low. "You rigged the system, paid off cops, ruined lives, and you thought no one would ever come for you." Vaughn gasped, struggling. "But please, I can fix this. We can work something out." Malcolm leaned in. "The system protects men like you, but not from me." Then he pressed a phone into Vaughn's shaking hand. "Call the press," Malcolm ordered. "Confess. Tell them everything, or I promise you your body will never be found." Vaughn saw the absolute certainty in Malcolm's eyes. And for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The next morning, Councilman Vaughn held a press conference. He sat at the podium, sweating, visibly shaken. I was part of a cover-up," he admitted. His voice shook. We protected bad cops. We silenced victims. We stole money from the people of this city. He swallowed hard, eyes darting around like he expected to be shot. "I confessed to everything." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. And as Vaughn crumbled, the system crumbled with him. Chief Slater jailed for 30-plus years. Councilman Vaughn forced to resign. Facing federal charges. Police union president disgraced. On the run from authorities. Entire police department under federal investigation. The people had won. For the first time in history, the corrupt were falling. And Malcolm Hayes? He was nowhere to be found. His mission was complete. Malcolm had destroyed the system. But the system doesn't go down without a fight. because now they were coming for him, and Malcolm was ready. Next, the final stand. Malcolm Hayes had become a legend. He had exposed an entire system, brought down the chief of police, a corrupt councilman, and the police union president. He had done what no one else had dared to do. He made the untouchable fall. The city was changing. The people had woken up. But power never surrenders without a fight. And the system still had one last move left. They were coming for him. Councilman Vaughn had confessed everything. But before he could face trial, he was found dead in his penthouse. Suicide, the reports claimed. But Malcolm knew better. The people in power weren't just going to sit back and let this happen. They had lost money, influence, control. They needed revenge. And Malcolm was their number one target. Behind closed doors, the remnants of the system gave the order. Send in the SWAT team. Eliminate him. Make it look like an accident. Malcolm wasn't reckless. After bringing down the system, he had gone off the grid. No phones, no credit cards, no digital footprint. But he still had eyes and ears everywhere. Through his old military contacts, he intercepted the SWAT order before it was carried out. They were coming for him, and he was ready. The SWAT team thought they were hunting Malcolm. But in reality, they were walking straight into his trap. Location: an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Malcolm's chosen battlefield. Lighting rigged, security cameras hacked. Explosives placed at all exits. Malcolm wasn't going to run. He was going to end this. 1:30 a.m. A black armored van pulled up outside the warehouse. 10 heavily armed SWAT officers, night vision goggles, tactical gear, orders: shoot to kill. Move in, the team leader ordered. The SWAT team breached the building. The place was dark, silent. The lead officer whispered into his radio. No visuals. Target not in sight. Then the lights flickered. The warehouse doors slammed shut, and a voice echoed over the building's speakers. Malcolm's voice. You came for me. The SWAT team froze. But did they tell you why? A video feed appeared on the warehouse walls. The truth. The evidence Malcolm had exposed. Callaway and Miller's crimes. Chief Slater's corruption. Councilman Vaughn's dirty deals. The order to have Malcolm assassinated. The SWAT officers watched in horror. They weren't hunting a terrorist. They were hunting a man who had exposed the real criminals. And then the explosions went off. Boom! The main entrance collapsed, cutting off their exit. Malcolm moved like a ghost in the dark. He took down the first officer silently, choking him out before he could even raise his weapon. He disabled their comms, cutting off their backup. He lured them into separate rooms, taking them out one by one. 10 men entered. Only one made it out. The SWAT commander was left alive, beaten, bloody, but breathing. Malcolm stood over him, eyes cold. Tell your bosses. The commander coughed, struggling to sit up. Tell them. What? Malcolm leaned in. Justice doesn't need a badge. It needs action. Then he vanished into the night. The lone surviving SWAT officer went to the press. He exposed everything. The illegal hit on Malcolm, the truth about the corrupt system, the final collapse of the old regime. The city had changed forever. No one could deny it now. Malcolm wasn't a villain. He was a legend, a ghost, a force of reckoning. And then he disappeared. Some say Malcolm left the city. Some say he still watches from the shadows, waiting for corruption to rise again. But one thing was certain. The system had tried to erase him, and instead, he erased them. The people would never forget. And if the system ever tried to rise again, Malcolm Hayes would be waiting. The end.